So there's a ceasefire in Lebanon. Well, kind of. I'll have all the details and analysis on whether this is even good for Israel coming up on In Focus. So it's great to be back in Israel after a week away in the United States, where I was meeting with people in Washington and in Florida. But I'm back here now. And just as I was flying home, the cabinet in Israel passed the ceasefire deal that Israel reached with the Biden administration, with some intervention or some involvement of France and the Lebanese government relating to the situation, the war in Lebanon. And it's a 60-day ceasefire. I want to go through some of the details of the ceasefire with you to understand really what it is for Israel. So first of all, why is it that we did it? So here, I think the most important thing to understand about why we did it is not because we were choosing between a ceasefire and maintaining the war effort. What we were choosing between was doing this particular deal with the Biden administration, not inside of the UN system, doing this deal for 60 days with President Biden and his team, and with some involvement of French President Macron and the Lebanese government, such as it is, or having the UN Security Council pass a binding ceasefire resolution that would have been forced on Israel. So either we could have agreed to one, or we would have been forced to accept one at much worse terms. In fact, France reportedly was planning on passing a ceasefire resolution that the United States ostensibly would abstain from, that would have sanctioned Israel, placed an international arms embargo on Israel in the framework of a ceasefire in Lebanon. So it was either international sanctions embargo or doing this deal. Those were the options that stood before Prime Minister Netanyahu. Okay, so there are bad parts of the agreement. A lot of them have been covered, but I'm just going to go through a few of them. So first of all, France. France is extremely hostile to Israel. The French government of Macron, they've barred Israelis from participating now in 2 international arms exhibitions in Paris, in Aix, that are genuinely hostile towards the government of Israel. You have obviously massive amounts of anti-Semitic assaults on the streets in Paris and in all the cities throughout France on a daily basis, and President Macron does nothing to stop it, does nothing to fight the jihadist anti-Semites, the left-wing anti-Semites that are making life very, very difficult for the Jews of France. And France in general has a very cooperative, strong post-colonialist bond with the government of Lebanon, which is an enemy government, and with Hezbollah, which of course is a terrorist organization. So France in general is a hostile force, and Israel did not want French involvement in this agreement in any way. And yet here it is, France is involved, and the payoff for Israel, such as it is that France announced that it would not respect the International Criminal Court's arrest warrant against Prime Minister Netanyahu and former Defense Minister Yoav Gallant. So on balance, was this good? Was it bad? It was a problem, but it's not an unmanageable problem. Again, this is a 60-day deal. We'll get into that in a second. And, we did get something for it. So that's France. Another problem with it is that we're supposed to leave Lebanon. Our forces are supposed to leave Lebanon by the end of the 60 days. Well, that's also bad, but right now they're in Lebanon. And right now it appears that a security zone is being developed along the border with Lebanon, inside of South Lebanon. So we'll just have to see how that transpires. Our forces remain in Lebanon and they remain fighting. They fight all of the Hezbollah fighters that are trying to return to the villages along the border with Israel. They killed 4 of them yesterday. We'll just have to see how these things develop. But our forces are not being withdrawn. They're not being withdrawn to Israel. They are not being withdrawn to the border area, at least for now. We don't see any evidence of that happening. To the contrary, And we have the Lebanese armed forces that everybody's so excited about, and they're supposed to be coming to the border zone to enforce the ceasefire deal. And as we've discussed numerous times on this program, the Lebanese armed forces and all of the Lebanese security forces are nothing more than Hezbollah auxiliary forces. They are not standalone forces. They are not sovereign forces. They are not above Hezbollah. They work for Hezbollah. They operate at the pleasure of Hezbollah. People can say that the power calculus between the Lebanese armed forces and Hezbollah has shifted during the course of this war, that the Hezbollah leadership has been decimated, and that's true. 4,000, apparently, according to the last assessment that I saw, 4,000 Hezbollah terrorists have been killed or incapacitated during the course of the last 2 months. And that is in comparison, say, to the Second Lebanon War of 2006, where all told Israel only killed 400 Hezbollah terrorists. So this is a much bigger deal. Israel absolutely destroyed their leadership echelons, and that's important. But all the same, Hezbollah remains the most powerful social force, the most powerful political force in Lebanon. And it remains in control of the Lebanese armed forces. So I don't take any comfort from the fact that a force that has been acting in open collusion with Hezbollah for the past 2 decades at a minimum is now going to be keeping the peace. Obviously, they didn't do it before October 8th when Israel began getting shelled by Hezbollah. And we discovered all of the tunnels and all of the battle stations and the massive amounts of arms caches that they had placed in order to invade our forces. Just yesterday, I saw a report that IDF forces actually found chemical weapons in areas that were supposed to be used as jumping off zones for invading Israel and attacking IDF forces. So they're planning on either sedating them or killing them and taking them hostage into Lebanon. So these are monsters. These are all monsters. They all behave illegally. Their entire force is illegal, and they were allowed to develop this massive military arsenal that they have to transform every single village in South Lebanon, including the ones along the border zones, as simply, a base of operations against Israel. All of these residents that are supposed to be coming back to places like Farkila, Marun Aras, etc., these are all Hezbollah terrorists who were placed there as civilians, as residents of these villages at the expense, for instance, of this Christian populations that used to populate these villages, but they were forced northward past the Litani River in most cases. And the villagers in these border villages are all members of the Radwan brigades of Hezbollah, and that's why their homes were also battle stations, because that's what they do. So if you allow them to come back, then you're allowing Hezbollah to regroup. At any rate, all of this happened while the Lebanese armed forces and, of course, the very vaunted UN forces in Lebanon, UNIFIL, right, that they were the ones who were supposed to be ensuring Hezbollah didn't do that. Hezbollah did it. They retook control over all of South Lebanon, and they rebuilt it as fortified positions to attack Israel from in every building in South Lebanon. And this was all done under the watchful eye and with the assistance of both the Lebanese armed forces and UNIFIL. So the idea that these two are supposed to maintain this ceasefire or block Hezbollah from rebuilding or dismantling Hezbollah forces in any way is a joke. So that's bad, obviously. And finally, there's this, side letter that everybody's talking about with the U.S., but basically what it says is that the United States has to give Israel permission to attack Hezbollah in the event that Hezbollah is acting in breach of the agreement, which it already is. And thankfully, at least for now, we see that Israel isn't asking permission for anything, and we're just attacking. So that's very important. But again, what we were faced with was a choice not between keeping up the war as we've been maintaining it and expanding it over the past 2 months, but rather agreeing to this deal or having a ceasefire forced on us from the UN Security Council. And that would have been much, much worse. And that's really a situation that we've seen Netanyahu operating in repeatedly during his long tenure in office. In 2009, for instance, when Obama came in and started reading him the Riot Act and demanding that Israel withdraw from Judea and Samaria and demanding the establishment of a Palestinian statehood, we saw Netanyahu say, okay, so here's what we're going to give you. We're not going to withdraw from any part of Judea and Samaria, but I will give you the minimum that I have to, which is a 9-month freeze on Jewish property rights in Judea and Samaria. Nobody was allowed to, increase the size of the porches in their backyards or balconies in their apartment buildings. Nobody was allowed, obviously, to build their home, even if they had a permit to do so, and it was land that was owned by them. Nobody was allowed, no Jew was allowed to make anything in Judea and Samaria, to construct anything for a whole 9-month period, which was terrible, and it set a horrible precedent. But the choice that he made was accepting a temporary freeze on Jewish property rights or removing Israel from territory. That is, making an irrevocable concession or making a temporary one that was going to cost him politically and that was going to harm his own voters and was inimical to Israel's interests. So he chose a building freeze, and he avoided having to actually withdraw from territory. The same thing, around the same time, Netanyahu announced that he supported the establishment of a demilitarized Palestinian state, something that his voters have never forgotten or forgiven him for doing. Why did he do it? Because as bad as it is to declare that you're in favor of something that you oppose because you understand that it's an existential threat to your country, if this is what you're faced with, it's not irrevocable because you haven't built the Palestinian state. It hasn't been established. So again, it's the same concept, is that when you have to choose, as Israel often does, when it's facing particularly a hostile administration, and we've never had a more hostile administration than the Obama-Biden administration, which we've now been facing, which is now ending its 12th year in power with the interregnum of Trump's first term in office. So we've never seen something that hostile as the current outgoing, thankfully, administration. And so you make your deals. He did similar things, by the way, during the Clinton administration as well. Is that when you're faced with a choice between taking an action that's irrevocable and taking an action and that's terrible, or taking an action that's reversible but terrible, Netanyahu always chooses the latter. And so that's sort of what we're seeing now. And having gone through all the reasons why this is terrible, we have to understand that in general, what's written in the agreement is unimportant. People are like, we have to see the agreement. Why haven't we seen the agreement? Why hasn't the agreement been shown? Well, it should be shown. I agree. I want to go through it too with a fine-tooth comb and see how terrible the drafting is and how bad it is for Israel. But I think that in general, when we're looking at this agreement, we have to realize that what it says actually is much less important than what it does. So what it does is it sets up a possibility of bad things happening or of good things happening. And I went through the parts about what's bad. But I think we have to understand that we've been facing for the past 4 years an administration that has literally been undermining Israeli sovereignty at every turn. And we've managed to stay afloat. Even after October 7th and even after the arms embargo, we managed to stay afloat. So like I said, they were threatening us with a UN Security Council resolution. And as Netanyahu said in his speech, there were 3 reasons to do this agreement. One was Iran, which I'll get to in a minute. The other one was the weapons supplies. And the third one, I think, was to concentrate as well on Gaza and to try to get the hostages out, which I'll talk about in a second. But the issue of the weapons supplies is important. I saw that they're sick. They're such liars. We've been under a growing weapons embargo for the past several. I started talking about it with you guys already in December, but not only have they been denying us the JDAMs, they've been denying us artillery and tank shells. They've been denying us the D9 bulldozers to clear mines and other things. They've been denying us, all of these basic war material that we need in order to win a war. They've been doing because they don't want us to win the war. So suddenly, and then after Netanyahu gave a speech where he talked about the arms embargo and said that, we're going to start seeing a resupply, and the implication was we'd see it when Trump came in, but here it's going to happen now with Biden. The Biden administration said, what is he talking about? There's been no arms embargo. We're not blocking arms shipments to Israel. That's what they always say. They just gaslight us. They lie all the time. Everybody knows that they're denying us weapons. they make it clear they block them from coming into Israel. And then they say, we're not blocking weapons. And then they send us a couple of Iron Dome missiles and say, see? But here they said, we're not doing it. And the Israeli media, which is insane and just serves the administration and anybody who says something bad about Netanyahu, said, see, he lied. Oh, yeah. But then lo and behold, yesterday they came out and said that they're going to be selling us the JDAMs again. And, smaller systems for precision-guided missiles and smaller projectiles. Well, there you go. So he was saying something. They said, you have to do this deal, otherwise we're not going to give you the JDAM. So fine, we get the JDAMs now, right? We can use them in 58 days. And then, I heard my friend Tony Badran, who's been on the show repeatedly, is my go-to guy for Lebanon, and he is up in arms about this deal. And again, so am I. You look at it and it's all bad, which particularly the part about the Lebanese armed forces. So Tony made a very compelling point, in my opinion, which was that he said, look, the problem with the Lebanese armed forces being involved in this deal, it's not so much what it says, it's what the LAF is for the United States. And that this is a bipartisan American project of believing that America can turn these Hezbollah answering military forces into a U.S. proxy. And it's pure fantasy. There's absolutely no way that it can happen. From the Obama perspective, this is great because it gives America and Iran a shared equity in Hezbollah-controlled Lebanon, which is deranged. But then everything that these people want to do in the Middle East is deranged and dangerous. And so this is one of the many things. And then during the Trump administration, inexplicably, Mike Pompeo, I think his name, Matthew Levitt, and others, Peter Berkowitz, they were pushing this idea that, yes, we should continue to fund the LAF. Why? Reasons, because that's the State Department bureaucracy, that's the Pentagon bureaucracy. And so Tony's fear is that if the United States continues with this fiction that you can support the LAF, give them arms, give them training from U.S. Special Forces, and pay their salaries, which is what's been going on for the past year and a half or so in cash, which is terror funding, pure and simple. This deal essentially gives a green light to all the bureaucrats in the State Department and in the Pentagon to just keep this deal going. And then you have this bureaucratic pattern that has already been ingrained, and then it just keeps going. It just keeps going. Yes, of course, we've agreed to this. Yes, it's in the deal. We're all going to do it. It's going to be great. So that, he said that's the problem, is that it sort of sets it up for the Trump administration. We already agreed to it. Let's just do it. So that is true. But then, if Israel says no, and this is a really bad idea, then, we're stuck having to explain this to President Trump and to his senior advisors. So here, the thing that we have to bear in mind is that Israel will have an easier time explaining why the LAF is not a reasonable, is not a reciprocal receptacle of American weapons, of American military training, of American money to Secretary of State Marco Rubio, then to Secretary of State Tony Blinken, to National Security Advisor Mike Waltz, then to National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, and to President Trump rather than President Biden. So I think that that's, first of all, very important. And that goes double for the reports that have been coming out in the Israeli media about how Trump himself has been involved with it. I saw that the American media also said it. There's a Wall Street Journal article that I have up that I haven't had a chance to read, also saying that Biden has a surprising new end of 10-year strategy, which is to involve Trump in his decision and his actions. And look, Trump supports the ceasefire deal. So again, if we say, no, this is a really bad idea, just as in the case with the LAF, we have the burden in Israel of having to explain to President Trump, to National Security Advisor Waltz, to Secretary of State Rubio, why this is bad and why we're not going to be able to maintain this ceasefire. And it might not be easy, but on the other hand, like I said, I just got back from the United States, where I was lucky to meet with some of my old colleagues who are going to be taking on senior positions in the Trump administration. both in Washington, I met with him, and then at this conference I spoke at in Florida with the David Horowitz Freedom Center, which was great. And I didn't get any impression from the people that I spoke with when I was there that's going to be an impossible conversation. Okay, like to the contrary, I did not get the impression that if Israel comes and says, "Look, we got to finish Hezbollah," that somebody like I don't know, Sebastian Gorka or let's see, the Secretary of Defense. I don't think that anybody is going to get angry with us. I think that everybody's going to be listening and respectful. And if we put together a plan that actually is coherent and we show it to them, they'll be like, okay, you got to do what you got to do. And yeah, you're right. You just killed Dakuk, who was a Hezbollah terrorist who executed in a grisly way 5 American soldiers in Iraq in Fallujah that he took hostage and executed. So, yeah, obviously this is our enemy as well, and I think that'll be a different Pete Hegseth, right? That's a defense secretary designate. I think we'll have a different conversation with them. And I think that it's important to bear that in mind. And I also think that it might be important to have those conversations up front. So that's the other thing. And speaking of Mike Waltz, I just want to show you a tweet that the National Security Advisor put out about the ceasefire. I think it's very telling. So I'll read you the part that says here, "I'm happy to seize practical steps to reduce tensions in the Middle East. However, it must be said unequivocally that the Iranian regime is the primary source of the chaos and terrorism that has spread in the region. We will not accept their continued support for terrorism." So what is he saying? He's saying, yeah, this is a nice, cute little ceasefire, but, it's not, from our perspective, and it's not a security blanket for Iran. And by the way, for Iran's proxies, although he doesn't say that, but he says, look, we're not giving Iran a pass for either what it's doing in pursuit of nuclear weapons or what it's doing in all of the states surrounding Israel and throughout the world where they have terrorist cells that are targeting not only Jews, but Americans, etc. We're not going to give them any sort of guarantee of any kind, and we don't think that the war against Iran has ended. And that, I think, is a very powerful and important statement. Now, what does this ceasefire deal mean for Netanyahu? So, first of all, his supporters are giving him the benefit of the doubt, which is very impressive. I mean, the Israeli people are not interested. There was a direct polls survey of voters for the coalition, that is Netanyahu voters, that came out. And I think that it was 87% of voters for the Likud and its coalition partners opposed the deal, oppose the ceasefire. Why? Because they want to keep fighting. But they're not up in arms against Netanyahu, and they're supporting Netanyahu. And you saw that with some very prominent names like Yitzhak Bonsal, whose son Amit Bonsal was killed in the war in fighting. And Yitzhak Bonsal has been one of the leaders of the Heroism Forum of the parents of fallen Israeli soldiers in this war. And he wrote a very long post explaining why he trusts Netanyahu here. And I think the reason that you have, despite serious misgivings and totally legitimate misgivings and correct misgivings about this deal, because the contents of the deal are not good, is because Netanyahu has demonstrated over the past 13 months that he is not standing down, that U.S. pressure did not get him to end this war, that he won't, that he keeps fighting, that he's unrelenting, that he will not stop until we achieve absolute victory. I mean, and there is, and it was true in Rafah, it was true in Khan Yunis, it's true in Lebanon, it was true throughout the war, it was true in the ground operation, it was true in going back to fighting after the ceasefire and the initial hostage deal in November. It was always true. He never stood down. When everybody thought he was going to stand down, he never stood down. So I think that, plus the fact that it's obvious that warts and all and frustrations and all, Netanyahu is unrivaled in Israeli politics. There's no possible alternative to Netanyahu, Benny Gantz, Yair Lapid, Naftali Bennett, who would have withstood all of the pressure that's been brought to bear against Israel since October 7th. They would have collapsed completely, probably in November already, and we would have lost because they simply wouldn't have been able to deal with the American pressure, and they wouldn't have. So we would never have gotten anywhere near where we've already gotten to had Netanyahu been replaced by one of the people who are the main contenders for the throne in Israel. And so he doesn't have a replacement today. And he has kept his words with the public. And so people say, okay, let's give them, let's give them the benefit of the doubt. And, and then we just have to have this question. Okay, so where are we now in terms of the war? What does a ceasefire mean for the future of the war? So the first thing it means is that the war goes on. Netanyahu said in his speech, it was a very weird speech for somebody announcing a ceasefire. He didn't mention the word ceasefire in his entire 9-minute speech. He talked about his determination to achieve absolute victory. He didn't talk about ending the war. He also, they didn't tell the residents of the communities in the north that they can come home. In fact, they said, no, you can't come home yet. It's not safe. Don't come home. So that's another statement. And, and he made very clear that, we have to do other things right now. We want to do other things. So I talked about the weapons that he said we needed to get. But, let's just think about what has happened in the first day of the ceasefire. So I just want to show you a clip from Aleppo, Syria. So what you're looking at here is that opposition forces to Bashar Assad, remember him, the genocidal president of Syria that acts as a puppet of Iran and to a lesser degree, but also significantly of Putin. So he committed genocide against the Sunnis of his country, who are the majority. And you have millions of Sunnis from Syria joined ISIS and other things, and they're operating in Europe and Turkey, etc. And because they were forced out or they were killed by the hundreds of thousands by Assad. So they don't like him very much. And for some reason, I know, because Hezbollah had been acting as Iran's proxy force, not only against Israel, but against Syrian rebels who are trying to oust Assad from power. And now Hezbollah has been decimated and there's a ceasefire. So suddenly, all of a sudden, within hours, I don't know who's backing them, but you have opposition forces going on a major offensive against the Syrian forces in Aleppo and around Aleppo. And that's like a very, very big deal. Here, I'll just read you. Syrian rebels advanced within 7 kilometers of Aleppo's city center, seizing dozens of towns, military bases, weapons depots, and tanks. They dealt significant losses to Iranian militias in Aleppo's western countryside during the first day of the fight. So that's interesting. That's going on in Syria. And it can happen against Iran's Syrian proxies because Hezbollah has been decimated. So that's Syria. And like I said, we are continuing to fight in Lebanon. We are killing Hezbollah terrorists who come too close to IDF forces who try to return to the villages along the border. It's not happening. Initially, there was some confusion. What are we supposed to do? Ask the IDF forces, and they didn't have clear guidance. But by 5 o'clock in the afternoon yesterday, they got guidance, and they're either supposed to shoot to kill if they are convinced that the people coming towards them are members of Hezbollah, or shoot to wound in the case of people that they're not sure of. So these are very clear guidelines. And as a lot of the reporters up in Kiryat Shmona and other border towns have said, from the amount of shooting that IDF forces are doing, it's very hard to believe that there's a ceasefire going on, but it's being enforced. And it's not being enforced by Hezbollah's auxiliary force, the LEF. It's being enforced by the IDF. So that's also very important. We have to remember the timeline, right? There are 58 days left of the ceasefire, and there are 53 days left of the Biden administration. This is very important, right? Because, we're facing the most hostile administration in history, and they have been undermining Israel at every turn to block us from winning. And so we agreed to this deal under duress from the Biden administration. But the Biden administration is going to be out before this deal is over. And that's very important. Let doddering Joe come in and declare that he's got this great deal to be had and he's doing great work and blah, blah, blah. And then, it ends in 5 days after he's out and we'll see what happens. And like I said, it's easier to talk to Marco Rubio and Donald Trump than it is to talk to Tony Blinken and Joe Biden. We also have other things to do. We have Gaza. So there were reports the other day, I think yesterday as well, that the IDF forces in Jabalia were able to corner a massive number of terrorists. They killed 40 of them in a firefight as they were trying to flee. And they were able to arrest tens of others who just gave up after they saw the first 40 killed. So that's important. And each one of those captured gives us more information about what's happening with the hostages. And we're hoping that we'll be able to make local deals more than with Hamas, because they're saying they're not going to make a deal. They've always said that. I believe them. So it's a question of getting to the guy who gets to the guy, right? Who'll take $5 million and a one-way ticket to, Qatar and free the hostages. So that's also where we're going. So we want to start focusing on that part of the mission of getting the hostages out, of seizing more control over Gaza. Because again, Gaza is not a state. We're not going to let the Palestinian Authority come in and turn it into what it was on October 6th, because that's what the Palestinian Authority does, because they're Hamas. And so we have to remain in control over Gaza in the long haul, and we have to get our hostages out. So that's that. And then we have Iran operating on other fronts too. I just want to show you this very scary footage here of what IDF forces and Shin Bet forces interdicted yesterday along the border with Jordan. So what are we seeing here? This is scary, right? We've got RPGs, we've got shoulder-held missiles, we've got mortars, we've got sniper rifles, and on and on and on. And look at the quantities. Okay, this is terrifying stuff, right? And, if this is what we caught yesterday, what didn't we catch the day before yesterday? What are we not catching today? There are Iranian forces stationed in Jordan overseeing this smuggling operation of weapons into Israel from the frontier with Jordan. We have a very, very long land border with Jordan. And Prime Minister Netanyahu said already, I think in September, and they're already trying to get it done, that we have to build a border fence. Until now, it has been the job of the Jordanian army essentially to block these kinds of things happening, far away from the border so that they don't have, right? And so for about 20 odd years, they did a fairly good job. They're not doing a good job anymore. So we didn't need a border fence. We didn't want a border fence because it's too expensive and yada, yada, yada. But now we need one. And so we're going to start building one. And, this is the new battlefield. And it's very frightening because you also have U.S. funded, U.S. trained, U.S. supported, sponsored Palestinian security services. You have Lieutenant General Mike Fensel, my old buddy from the Kennedy School at Harvard, who's been spending his tenure here putting together sanctions against Israeli Jews in Judea and Samaria and making these Palestinian security forces who commit terrorist activities, as I said already in March when I was showing you the report put out by Regavim that showed, I think, 70 different Palestinian security officers who were engaged in actual murder of Israelis, and that's just what they were able to get from open source information. I can't imagine the mind reels at what you would know if you had access to the intelligence data on the actual activities of these U.S. funded, sponsored, and armed forces. So you have that, and you have this massive footprint that Iran is trying to build in Judea and Samaria with these advanced weaponry. That's another area that we're going to have to operate in. And I would assume, and I would certainly advise that Israel should keep up what we're doing and not escalating until we have, until the cavalry from Washington arrives, or at least you have a changing of the guard so that we're not going to find ourselves under UN Security Council sanctions if we go after in a major way the Palestinian security forces and their augmented forces from Iran. So I think that's really important. We have Judea and Samaria that we have to worry about, and we are carrying out major counterterror operations in northern Samaria, and that's important. But it's a drop in the bucket in terms of the actual threat that we're facing in Judea and Samaria. And finally, Iran itself. I mean, as I said in his speech announcing the ceasefire, Netanyahu gave the first reason was that we have to handle Iran, and then he said, "Enough said." Well, it's not enough said. That's why I'm here. I'll just say a little bit more, right? So I think, the goal, as Netanyahu said, and two, I think, speeches that he gave to the people of Iran in the recent months, we want to see this regime overthrown, but we want to see this regime overthrown as as quickly as possible, but there's a sequence that probably has to happen. Iran's nuclear installations have to be destroyed. Right? It doesn't matter, right? Because then you don't worry as much about who takes over afterwards. That becomes an internal Iranian problem. It remains an international problem and certainly an Israeli problem so long as whoever may take over would be at the cusp of a nuclear weapon. So since we don't want to have to deal with who takes over Iran, because that's Iran's decision to make, that's the decision of the Iranian people, those nukes have to go. All those nuke installations have to be destroyed. Israel does it. Maybe with an assist from Trump, if it's possible to wait that long. I doubt it. And then, you bring them down with economic sanctions, major economic sanctions, go after the 400 ghost ships that are traversing the waters of the Straits of Hormuz and giving Iran massive profits from their oil and gas exports to China and other countries. So get rid of that, block those ghost ships from anchoring in Iranian ports so that they can't operate any longer. And Iran, aside from their pipelines, is cut off from international oil markets and goes bankrupt. And I think that those two things will clear the path for the Iranian people to seize control over their destiny and oust this regime from power. So it's take out the nuclear sites, destroy the economy through oil sanctions by going after the ghost ships, and then, bring in all of the satellites that Elon Musk uses to allow people access to internet. I think that all of those things are important. So whatever Biden said, and he says that the war is over and it's not going to start again, whatever. He tell it to the judge. And so I think, when we look at the situation, again, we see, and it's very disturbing, that, after all of this time and as an Israeli, and our son is back in Gaza for the third time, it's very disheartening. And all of the soldiers who already have been killed, we're past that 800 mark, and every single one of them is a gut punch. And the fact that the hostages are still there, 101 of them, is just impossible to get your heads around. And we suddenly have to do the ceasefire. Yeah, well, the reason why the war has lasted this long and the reason why the hostages are still there, and the reason why we have to go to a ceasefire is because the United States has been run this entire time by an administration who has believed all along that what really has to happen is that Hezbollah has to survive and remain in control with their puppets, with the LAF around them and the fake Lebanese government around them, etc. And that Iran has to remain in a situation where it is on the cusp of nuclear weapons and allowed to, build its array of terror proxy armies that are never destroyed. I mean, the main damage that the Houthis have absorbed over the past year of their pirate warfare against shipping in the Strait, in the Bandar. Now I'm suddenly in the straits. There is America. Is Israel did it? We hit the Port of Hodeidah, and it was on fire for weeks after Israel bombed it. What have the Americans and British done? Very little. So the Houthis are still in charge of Yemen. They shouldn't be, but they are, because they're an Iranian equity, as my friend Tony Badran would say, and nobody wants to harm Iran's equities in the administration, and therefore they haven't been harmed. Giora Island, who is one of the hundreds of Netanyahu-hating leftist generals who are retired, who are running this whole effort to oust her from power and have been for the past, 6 years, right? So he's no supporter of Netanyahu, but he said very openly a couple of weeks ago in a media interview that the reason that the hostages are still in Gaza is because the Biden administration has insisted since the very first days of the war that Israel resupply Hamas with this fake humanitarian aid, right? That's it. That humanitarian aid has been a death sentence to the hostages. If we had been allowed, as we are under international law, to deny Hamas fuel, food, water, medicines until they cough up the hostages, if we had been allowed to open the international border with Egypt so that Gaza civilians could have left, rather than feeding them through Hamas, then they would have been forced to release the hostages months ago. But because this has been the steady demand of the Biden administration, they're still there, right? And it's the same with the war. If they hadn't made us conduct fruitless, and they knew that they were fruitless, negotiations for months over a non-existent deal to release the hostages from, December through May, when everybody had to acknowledge that there was no deal, we could have been in Rafah by January. It could have been over by then. We could have blocked the resupply in January instead of May. But that didn't happen. And, the war may have ended already in the wintertime. Last winter, not this winter. But the Biden administration didn't want to oust Hamas from power, and it still doesn't. It doesn't want Israel to take control over Gaza. Tony Blinken made that very clear in the outset of the war. They blocked anybody from Gaza leaving. They said in no uncertain terms, no Gazan is allowed to leave Gaza. They made it almost impossible together with Egypt. They supported President Sisi in this. So, if they had taken rational policies, rational from the perspective of if they had been acting as Israel's ally, not slow walking or embargoing weapons, not forcing Israel on pain of, arrest warrants against our leaders at the International Criminal Court, right? If they had been backing Israel's legal plan to besiege Gaza, to lay siege on Gaza from the outset of the war would have been over months and months ago. The hostages would have been freed months and months ago. And in Lebanon, there wouldn't be a ceasefire that allows Hezbollah to do the V sign with whatever remaining fingers they have and put up their Hezbollah flags and deflate all of the Israelis who have been, waiting and waiting and watching and know how dangerous these people are. And they can't be allowed anywhere near us ever again. Wouldn't have to face those pictures, but that's not the situation that we've been in. So we make this deal. It's a temporary deal. It's got 58 days left on the clock, 53 days left on the clock of the most hostile U.S. administration in history. And, we have other things to do. We have other fish that we have to fry. We have other areas in the Seven Front War that we're going to focus on now. And we're not going to let them take over South Lebanon. That's why our forces are still there. That's why they're not going to leave. And I think that's the way that we have to see it. It's not a time to look at this deal with the eyes of the lawyer, which is how I usually would look at it. The clock is running. It's running down. We need to make the best of a situation that we're in. And I think that with all the heartache, and it really is a bellyache, I think with all the heartache and looking at this, instead of feeling frustrated, say, okay, all right, now we have a time to regroup. We have a time to focus on other fronts. We have a time to wait and wait for 53 days until we have the second inauguration of Donald J. Trump. Anyway, those are my thoughts. Really glad to be home. And I'll talk to you all next week. I have some great interviews coming up. You're going to love it, and more analysis. So happy Thanksgiving to everybody. I was supposed to say that at the outset, but I forgot. I'm going up to start cooking, and I will see you all again next week. Shabbat Shalom.